I'm Ian Morrison. I'm Director of Policy at Historic England. If you don't know who Historic England are, we're a government agency that is funded by the taxpayer to protect and champion England's historic environment. Now, we've got a session today, three speakers. I will be going first, talking briefly about the value of heritage. Matthew McKeague from the Architectural Heritage Fund, an innovative charity that's helped bring countless hundreds of historic buildings back into use. We'll talk about the work they're doing to support enterprising communities. And we're very fortunate to have Roger Hunt, who's a prolific writer and guru on sustainable buildings, materials and construction. And he'll be talking about techniques and design considerations. So we've got quite a lot to get through. I hope we want to leave some time at the end for questions, if you have any questions, so I'll crack on. Before I talk about the 7 things that heritage can do to you, I'm just going to start with some statistics, which puts the context of how heritage contributes, how historic architecture contributes to the building stock in this country. The first thing is there are 24 million dwellings in England, of which only 2% are individually protected through legislation. That's roughly 500,000 listed buildings. There are 5.5 million pre-1919 traditional buildings, historic buildings, and they make up 1/4 of England's historic building stock. There are also 10,000 conservation areas which have been designated since 1967, and within those areas they provide homes for nearly 9 million people, or 12.5% of the population. And importantly, there is a value to heritage. So residential prices in conservation areas are on average 23% higher than outside conservation areas. And the myth that heritage stops development, actually the actual rate of new development in conservation areas is largely the same as outside, close to the national average. And heritage really matters to people. 74% of adults in England believe the character and appearance of conservation areas should be protected, and only 4% of people disagree. Just one more slide on statistics. The actual contribution of heritage and the value that it makes to the UK economy is rarely appreciated. It is actually worth over £12 billion, and it makes a greater contribution to the UK economy than the defence industry, aerospace and the arts and culture activities. So, back to the 7 things that heritage can do to you, where heritage makes a major contribution to public life. And I'm going to quickly run through each of these areas. So, tourism, education and skills, sense of place and identity, personal development, environmental concerns, very importantly, quality of life and regeneration. So starting with tourism, there's been a significant surge of interest in heritage, as demonstrated by this graph here. Visits to historic properties have risen by 55% over the last 30 years, and they are still rising steeply. Many overseas visitors bringing in much needed spend, which are boosting local economies and providing employment in areas where some employment opportunities are scarce. These numbers give the scale of the contribution that's made by heritage-related tourism. 17.8 million international heritage-related visits in 2016, spending over 9 billion. And the actual true value of the heritage tourism economy is worth nearly 17 billion. In terms of education and skills, heritage work actually makes up a significant portion of all construction activity in the UK. There are 94,000 construction workers who are generating £6.6 billion worth of construction activity. And there are also 29,000 architects, civil engineers, chartered surveyors and other professionals involved in heritage-related activities. And some of these figures demonstrate the advantage of working with heritage. 40% of all construction work is on pre-1919 buildings. The repair and reuse of traditional historic buildings is far more labour-intensive than constructing new ones. So it creates new jobs and it means less waste. And I'll come on to that, say a bit more about that in a minute. 95% of the supported conservation skills of work that we've supported in finding placement for apprenticeships and other conservation skills have found full-time employment in the heritage sector, which is a very impressive return. And also heritage reaches pupils. So we run a Heritage Schools programme, and it is delivering actually quite incredible results in terms of using heritage to engage children with new activities outside the classroom, boosting their confidence and their aspirations for the future. People, as I said, really value their heritage. The frequent polling demonstrates just how important heritage is to people, how they think about their area, their pride in their area and where they live and work. So 71% of people, when they were polled, said they're interested in the history of their local place. 87% said finding new uses for historic buildings is better than demolishing them. Now to something that's quite difficult to measure, but we've tried to do that, and that's really trying to understand the contribution that heritage makes to people's well-being. So this slide shows the results of a research by Symmetrica in 2013 using a recognised well-being valuation method. The monetised figures show how much benefit on average people feel they get from heritage visits in pounds and pence every year. I wouldn't read too much into the actual figure, but in terms of relativity, it's very interesting in that visiting a heritage attraction or visiting a heritage town, people believe is more beneficial for their well-being than visiting a library, playing sport, or participating in the arts. I mentioned I'd cover environmental waste, which is one of the main reasons why we should all be interested in finding new uses for existing historic buildings. Because restoring a historic building is inherently more sustainable than demolition and building anew, and I'm sure Roger will say a lot more about that in a moment. The construction industry, as I'm sure you've heard elsewhere, still is responsible for consuming a huge amount of materials, 50% of steel, 26% of aluminium, and 25% of all plastic in the world. And we've done some analysis working with Historic Environment Scotland. So this conversion of a warehouse in Edinburgh, converting that into commercial offices, into apartments, saved the equivalent of 1.5 million litres of petrol, as opposed to demolition and rebuild. In terms of quality of life, you won't be able to read this slide. What it just does is shows the correlation between investment in heritage and recognition of improvement by local people of the area in which they live. And there is a strong correlation, you'll have to believe me, of the quality of heritage and how people feel about their area. And lastly, regeneration. The built historic environment influences perceptions of the quality and attractiveness of place, and this specifically relates to business. A poll of businesses found that the quality of the built historic environment was as important to businesses when they decide where to locate as road access. And also there's a really strong affinity between the creative industries, the fastest growing parts of our economy, and historic buildings, with many creative industries concentrated in historic areas in our towns and cities. And finally, a scheme that we ran from 2012 to 2017 in Derby to bring the High Street in Derby back into use, to revitalise it by focusing on restoring lost architectural features, lost shop fronts, actually turned one of the worst performing high streets in the country in terms of vacancy into no vacancy rates at all. And it was for that reason that the government have invested 40 million into Historic England to help in the Future High Streets Fund to help us regenerate 40 high streets, historic high streets across the country. So that, in a very rapid run-through, is 7 things that heritage do for the public. I could go on and on, but 15 minutes doesn't provide me much time. So just a couple more slides, which are relevant, I think, to the content of this conference. And this slide shows the role that heritage is playing in providing new homes. Most, of course, comes from new development. You would expect this, but increasingly older buildings, so buildings which are built before 1919, particularly former industrial buildings, are being converted to create highly desirable residences with actually a significant uplift in value compared to new builds. And this is something that we refer to and is referred to in the industry as the heritage premium. We're seeing this number increase considerably as former industrial mills and factories are brought back into quirky places for people to live, and we expect this number to accelerate dramatically over the coming years. And we're working very closely with other government departments and home builders to see how we might achieve better results. So heritage has a vital role to play in resolving this country's housing crisis. Sorry, there's the slide about so. So finally, all of the information that I've said related today, we publish in 2 books on our website, which are available for PDF. So if you wanted to find out more about the statistics I've provided and the research that went into them, please do visit our website and access those documents.